Misogynist laughs at woman leading a protest, then discovers her father's identity. The sun beat down on the bustling city square as dozens of people gathered with signs and banners. The words equal pay, justice for all, and respect women were scrawled in bold letters across the signs, their bright colors clashing with the drab office buildings surrounding the protest. At the center of the crowd stood Emma, a young woman with fiery determination in her eyes. She gripped a megaphone in one hand and a list of demands in the other, her voice cutting through the chatter. "This is not just about one workplace or one group of people," Emma shouted, her voice carrying over the crowd. "This is about fairness and dignity for everyone. We will not be silenced." The crowd cheered, their voices merging into a powerful chorus. Emma stood tall on the bed of a pickup truck, her presence commanding despite her small frame. She wore a plaid skirt and a dark blazer, her hair tied back into a no-nonsense ponytail. She was young, passionate, and relentless, a force to be reckoned with. Across the square, Mark leaned against a lamppost, his arms crossed and a smug smirk plastered across his face. Dressed in a leather jacket and jeans, he exuded the air of someone who had nothing to prove and everything to mock. To him, the protest was nothing more than a joke, a waste of time and energy. "Look at her," Mark said, nudging his friend Todd. "Acting like she's gonna change the world with a megaphone and a pickup truck?" Todd chuckled, his own expression skeptical. "Yeah, good luck with that. Bet half these people don't even know what they're yelling about." Mark laughed, the sound loud and mocking. "Exactly. Just another wannabe revolutionary trying to play hero. She's probably just mad she didn't get promoted or something." Todd shrugged, clearly more interested in the sandwich he was eating than the protest. "Still, she's got guts to stand up there like that." Mark rolled his eyes. "Guts? Please. It's all for attention. People like her don't want change, they just want to feel important." Despite his dismissive attitude, Mark couldn't help but watch as Emma continued to rally the crowd. There was something about her confidence, her unwavering determination, that irritated him. She wasn't backing down, even as a few hecklers shouted insults from the sidelines. Instead, she addressed them directly, her tone calm but firm. "To those of you who think this is pointless," Emma said, her gaze sweeping over the crowd, "I invite you to join us and learn why we're here. If you have questions, ask them. If you have doubts, challenge them. But don't stand there and mock people who are fighting for something that matters." Her words stung, though Mark would never admit it. He straightened, his smirk fading slightly. "Who does she think she is?" he muttered. Todd glanced at him. "She's got a point, man. Why do you care so much, anyway?" "I don't care," Mark snapped, his tone defensive. "I just think it's ridiculous, that's all." Todd shrugged again, turning his attention back to his sandwich. Mark, however, couldn't let it go. The more he watched Emma, the more she got under his skin. He didn't like being called out, especially not by someone like her, a woman who, in his mind, was overstepping her place. As the protest continued, Mark decided to make his presence known. He strolled casually toward the crowd, weaving through the clusters of people until he was close enough to hear Emma's every word. She was in the middle of explaining the wage gap statistics when he interrupted her with a loud, sarcastic laugh. "Seriously?" Mark said, his voice cutting through the air. "You think yelling in a square is gonna solve all that?" The crowd turned to look at him, their expressions ranging from annoyed to confused. Emma's gaze locked onto Mark, her eyes narrowing slightly. She stepped down from the truck bed, megaphone still in hand, and walked toward him. "Do you have a question?" she asked, her tone measured. Mark smirked, crossing his arms. "Yeah. What makes you think anyone's gonna take you seriously? You're just another loudmouth with a sign." A few gasps rippled through the crowd, but Emma didn't flinch. Instead, she met his gaze head-on, her expression unyielding. "And you're just another critic with no solutions. So what's your point?" The crowd murmured in approval, and Mark's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. He hadn't expected her to be so quick on her feet. Still, he wasn't about to back down. "My point," he said, his tone dripping with condescension, "is that this is all a waste of time. You think a bunch of slogans and shouting is gonna change anything? Newsflash, the world doesn't work like that." Emma tilted her head, studying him like he was a particularly stubborn puzzle. "You're right," she said finally. "The world doesn't change just because we want it to. It changes because people stand up and demand better." "That's what we're doing here," Mark scoffed. "Demand better? From who? Your parents? Your teachers? Grow up. The world's not fair, and whining about it won't make it fair." Emma took a step closer, her voice steady and deliberate. "You're right again. The world isn't fair. But that doesn't mean we should accept it. If no one challenges the system, nothing will ever change." The crowd erupted in applause, and Mark's smirk disappeared entirely. For the first time, he felt the weight of the crowd's judgment, their eyes boring into him like spotlights. Still, he refused to back down. "Whatever," he muttered, turning on his heel. "Good luck with your little parade." As he walked away, the crowd parted to let him through, their whispers following him like shadows. Emma watched him go, a mixture of frustration and pity flickering across her face. She hadn't expected to change his mind, but she had hoped he might at least listen. Back at his apartment that evening, Mark couldn't shake the encounter. He paced the living room, replaying the conversation in his head. Her words had gotten to him, though he didn't want to admit it. There was something about her confidence, her conviction, that he found both infuriating and intriguing. He sat down at his laptop, determined to prove her wrong. He searched for information about the protest, hoping to find evidence of its futility. Instead, he stumbled upon an article featuring Emma's name and photo. The headline read, "Activist Emma Hensley leads fight for gender equality." Mark clicked on the article, his curiosity outweighing his annoyance. The piece detailed Emma's background, her education, her previous campaigns, and the work she had done to advocate for marginalized communities. It also mentioned her father, though only in passing. The name caught Mark's eye, Jonathan Hensley. "Wait a second," Mark muttered, his brow furrowing. He typed Jonathan Hensley's name into the search bar, his heart skipping a beat as the results loaded. The screen filled with images and headlines. Jonathan Hensley was no ordinary man. He was a billionaire, a prominent philanthropist, and one of the most influential business leaders in the country. Mark's stomach twisted. He had spent the afternoon mocking the daughter of one of the most powerful men in the world, and he hadn't even realized it. Mark leaned back in his chair, staring at the computer screen in disbelief. The name Jonathan Hensley seemed to leap out at him, taunting him. A billionaire, a philanthropist, and a man with connections that likely extended into every powerful circle imaginable. And Emma? She wasn't just some random protester, she was his daughter, a fact that instantly reframed everything Mark had said and done. "Damn it," Mark muttered, running a hand through his hair. He felt a pang of unease creeping up his spine. What if Emma told her father about their confrontation? What if Jonathan Hensley decided to ruin him? The thought made Mark's stomach churn. But as he paced the room, his unease gave way to anger. "So what?" he said aloud, trying to convince himself. "She's just riding on her dad's coattails. That's all these protests are, rich kids trying to feel important." Deep down, though, Mark knew his words were hollow. Emma hadn't mentioned her father once during the protest. Everything she had said, every point she had made, had come from her own conviction. She wasn't leveraging her family's wealth or influence. She was standing on her own. That realization only made Mark angrier. He hated feeling small, and right now, Emma Hensley made him feel like the smallest man in the world. The next day, Mark found himself back at the city square, though he wasn't entirely sure why. The protest was still going strong, the crowd slightly larger than before. Emma stood at the center, her voice just as passionate as the day before. Mark lingered on the outskirts, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. As he watched, he noticed something he hadn't paid attention to before, the way the crowd responded to Emma. It wasn't just about her words, it was the way she carried herself, the way she listened to people who approached her, the way she seemed to genuinely care about the issues she was fighting for. She wasn't just a leader, she was an inspiration. Mark scoffed, trying to shake off the thought. He wasn't here to admire her. He was here to prove to himself that she was just another privileged rich girl playing at activism. But the more he watched, the harder it became to hold onto that belief. "Hey," a voice said, snapping him out of his thoughts. Mark turned to see Todd approaching, a coffee cup in hand. "Didn't expect to see you here again." Mark shrugged, his tone defensive. "Just wanted to see if they're still wasting their time." Todd raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. Sure." They stood in silence for a moment, watching as Emma answered questions from a small group of reporters. Her demeanor was calm but firm, her words clear and thoughtful. Even the reporters seemed impressed, jotting down notes with serious expressions. "You know," Todd said, breaking the silence, "she's pretty impressive. Don't see many people willing to stand up like that." Mark rolled his eyes. "She's got her dad to back her up. It's easy to take risks when you've got a safety net." "Maybe," Todd said, taking a sip of his coffee. "But you gotta admit, she's doing more than we are." Mark didn't respond. He hated how right Todd was. Later that afternoon, Mark found himself wandering closer to the center of the protest. He didn't know what he was looking for, answers, maybe, or a way to prove to himself that he hadn't been entirely wrong about Emma. But as he got closer, he realized just how out of place he was. The protesters gave him wary looks, clearly recognizing him from the day before. "Back to cause more trouble?" one of them asked, his tone sharp. Mark shook his head. "Just here to watch." The man snorted but didn't push further. Mark continued toward the pickup truck where Emma stood, surrounded by a group of volunteers. She was organizing supplies, her focus entirely on the task at hand. Mark hesitated, unsure if he should approach her. Part of him wanted to apologize, but another part, the part that still clung to his pride, wasn't ready to admit he had been wrong. Before he could make up his mind, Emma noticed him. Her eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't look away. Instead, she handed a clipboard to one of the volunteers and walked toward him, her expression unreadable. "You again," she said, crossing her arms. "What do you want this time?" Mark hesitated, the weight of her gaze making him feel like a child caught misbehaving. "I just wanted to see what all the fuss was about." Emma raised an eyebrow. "And?" Mark shrugged, his tone defensive. "It's a good turnout. I'll give you that." Emma's lips twitched, though it wasn't quite a smile. High praise coming from someone who thinks we're wasting our time. Mark winced. "Look, about yesterday, maybe I was out of line." "Maybe," Emma repeated, her tone laced with sarcasm. Mark sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Fine. I was out of line. Happy?" Emma didn't respond immediately. Instead, she studied him, as if trying to decide whether his apology was genuine. Finally, she nodded. "It's a start." Mark felt a strange mix of relief and annoyance. He wasn't used to being the one to apologize, and he definitely wasn't used to people like Emma holding the moral high ground. But there was something about her, something he couldn't quite put into words, that made him want to be better. Over the next few days, Mark found himself returning to the square, each visit chipping away at the walls he had built around himself. He still didn't agree with everything Emma said, but he couldn't deny the impact she was having. The protest was gaining traction, drawing attention from local news stations and sparking conversations across the city. One afternoon, as Mark lingered on the outskirts of the crowd, he overheard a conversation between two reporters. "Did you hear about her dad?" one of them asked. "Yeah," the other replied. "Jonathan Hensley. Can you believe it? A billionaire's daughter leading a grassroots protest. Talk about ironic." Mark felt a pang of unease. He had assumed Emma's connection to her father would be a liability, but the reporters didn't seem to think so. If anything, they seemed impressed by her ability to stand on her own, separate from her family's wealth and influence. "Still," the first reporter said, "you have to wonder how much of this is her and how much is him. You think he's funding the whole thing?" The second reporter shook her head. "Doubt it. She's been pretty vocal about not relying on her dad. If anything, I bet he's the one who's uncomfortable with all this attention." Mark frowned, the pieces starting to fall into place. Emma wasn't just fighting for equality, she was fighting to prove herself, to show the world that she was more than her father's name. That evening, Mark found himself standing in front of Emma's pickup truck as the crowd began to disperse. She was packing up supplies, her movements efficient but tired. When she saw him, she paused, a mixture of surprise and annoyance flickering across her face. "You're persistent," she said, her tone guarded. "What do you want now?" Mark hesitated, the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. "I read about your dad," he said finally. "Jonathan Hensley." Emma's expression didn't change, but her shoulders tensed slightly. "What about him?" "I didn't know who you were," Mark admitted. "Not at first." "And now that you do?" Emma asked, her tone sharp. Mark shifted uncomfortably. I just don't get why you're doing all this. You've got everything. Money, connections, power. Why fight?" Emma stared at him, her gaze steady. "Because having those things doesn't mean I don't see what's wrong with the world. And it doesn't mean I don't have a responsibility to try and fix it." Mark opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. For the first time in his life, he didn't have a comeback. Mark stood there, silent, as Emma's words hung in the air. Responsibility. That wasn't a word he often thought about, and certainly not in the way she meant it. For most of his life, Mark had avoided responsibility like it was a plague, preferring to laugh things off, mock others, and keep his distance from anything that required genuine effort or accountability. But Emma's conviction shook something inside him. The way she carried herself, the fire in her voice, it was unlike anything he had ever seen. And for the first time, he couldn't brush it off. He couldn't convince himself that she was just another privileged kid playing at activism. There was something real about her, something he couldn't ignore. "I don't get you," Mark said finally, his voice quieter than usual. "Why not just use your dad's influence to get what you want? You could make calls, pull strings, get things done without all this." He gestured vaguely at the remnants of the protest. Emma sighed, crossing her arms. "Because change doesn't come from the top down. It comes from people. Real people. If I relied on my father's name, it would send the wrong message. It would tell everyone that you need money and power to make a difference. But that's not true." Mark frowned, her words stirring something uncomfortable within him. "Yeah, but doesn't it feel like a waste? I mean, look at this." He pointed to the now empty square, littered with discarded signs and flyers. "You've been out here for days, and what's really changed? People hear you, they clap, and then they go back to their lives. Nothing's different." Emma studied him for a moment, her gaze unflinching. "Maybe you're right," she said. "Maybe not everyone listens. Maybe not everything changes. But some people do. And even if I only reach one person, that's enough." Mark scoffed, but there was no real malice in it. "That's pretty idealistic." Emma shrugged. "Maybe. But what's the alternative? Sitting around and doing nothing? Laughing at people who try? No thanks." Her words stung, though she hadn't said them cruelly. Mark looked away, his jaw tightening. He didn't like being confronted like this, especially by someone like Emma. But deep down, he couldn't deny that she was right. He had spent most of his life tearing others down, mocking their efforts, and doing everything he could to avoid looking at his own shortcomings. And now, standing in front of Emma, he felt exposed. Over the next few days, Mark found himself returning to the protest, though he kept his distance. He wasn't ready to admit that Emma had gotten under his skin, but he couldn't stay away. Something about her, her passion, her determination, drew him in even as he fought against it. He began listening more closely to her speeches, paying attention to the statistics she shared, the stories she told. At first, he tried to poke holes in her arguments, but the more he listened, the harder it became to find fault. Her points were well-researched, her passion genuine. She wasn't just shouting into the void, she was educating, inspiring, planting seeds of change. One afternoon, as Mark lingered near the edge of the crowd, he overheard two older women talking. "She's incredible, isn't she?" one of them said, clutching a small sign that read, "Equal Rights Now." The other nodded, her expression thoughtful. "She reminds me of her father, in a way. But she's braver. She's not hiding behind boardroom walls. She's out here, facing it head-on." Mark's curiosity got the better of him. "What do you mean?" he asked, stepping closer. The women glanced at him, surprised by his interruption. "Her father," the first woman said. "Jonathan Hensley. You've heard of him, haven't you?" Mark nodded. "Yeah, I've read about him. Big shot billionaire, right?" The woman chuckled. "That's one way to put it. He's a good man, but he's careful. Too careful. He's spent his whole life building his empire, but he's never taken a stand like Emma has. She's putting everything on the line for what she believes in, and that's something you don't see every day." Mark frowned, his mind racing. He had assumed Jonathan Hensley was fully supportive of Emma's activism, but the woman's words suggested otherwise. Was Emma really out here alone without her father's backing? The thought unsettled him. That evening, Mark did something he hadn't done in years. He researched. He sat at his laptop for hours, poring over articles, interviews, and videos about Emma and her father. What he found surprised him. Emma had been organizing protests and advocating for social justice since college, long before her father's name had come into the picture. In fact, Jonathan Hensley had rarely spoken publicly about his daughter's activism. When he did, his tone was neutral, almost distant. It was clear that while he respected her efforts, he wasn't fully aligned with them. Mark leaned back in his chair, his thoughts swirling. Emma wasn't just fighting against societal norms. She was also fighting against the expectations placed on her by her own family. And she was doing it with courage and grace. For the first time, Mark felt a pang of admiration for her. She wasn't just talk, she was action. She was everything he wasn't. The next day, Mark arrived at the protest earlier than usual. The crowd was smaller than it had been, the energy subdued. Emma was standing near the pickup truck, talking to a small group of volunteers. She looked tired, her voice quieter than usual, but her determination hadn't wavered. Mark hesitated, then approached her. When she saw him, her expression was wary. "You again," she said. "What is it this time?" "I want to help," Mark said, surprising even himself. Emma blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Help?" "Yeah," Mark said, rubbing the back of his neck. "I've been thinking about what you said. About how even small changes matter. I don't know. Maybe it's time I stopped being part of the problem." Emma studied him, her expression skeptical. "Why the sudden change of heart?" Mark shrugged, trying to play it cool. "Let's just say you made an impression." For a moment, Emma didn't respond. Then, slowly she nodded. "All right, but if you're serious about this, you have to be all in. No half measures." Mark nodded, his jaw tightening. "I'm all in." Over the next week, Mark threw himself into the protest. At first, the other volunteers were wary of him, but as they saw him handing out flyers, helping with setup, and even speaking to passersby about the movement, their attitudes began to shift. Mark wasn't just standing on the sidelines anymore, he was part of the fight. It wasn't easy. There were moments when Mark felt overwhelmed, out of his depth. But every time he thought about giving up, he remembered Emma's words, "Even if I only reach one person, that's enough." And somehow, those words gave him the strength to keep going. By the end of the week, Mark had become a fixture at the protest. He wasn't leading chants or giving speeches, but he was there, doing the work, standing alongside Emma and the others. And for the first time in his life, he felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. One evening, as the protest wound down for the day, Emma approached Mark. She handed him a water bottle, her expression thoughtful. "You've been doing good work," she said. Mark took the bottle, his brow furrowing. "Thanks, I guess." Emma smiled faintly. "I mean it. I didn't think you'd stick around, but you proved me wrong." Mark hesitated, then nodded. "I guess. I just realized how wrong I've been. About a lot of things." Emma's smile widened, her eyes softening. "That takes courage, you know. Admitting you were wrong." Mark chuckled, the sound tinged with self-deprecation. "Yeah, well, it's a start." They stood in silence for a moment, the sounds of the city fading into the background. For the first time, Mark felt a sense of peace, a quiet understanding that he was finally on the right path. And it was all because of Emma. The days stretched into weeks, and Mark found himself becoming an integral part of the protest effort. What had once been an idle curiosity, driven by annoyance and skepticism, had now become a personal mission. Mark wasn't sure when the shift had happened, but he could feel it deep inside him, a desire to finally stand for something. At first, he had stuck to small tasks, handing out flyers, organizing supplies, and setting up banners. But as time went on, Emma began trusting him with more significant responsibilities. She saw the change in him, the way he listened more than he spoke, the way he showed up every day despite the ridicule he received from friends who still didn't understand. One afternoon, as the protest reached its peak, Emma asked Mark to take the microphone and address the crowd. Mark's immediate instinct was to refuse. Public speaking wasn't his thing, and the thought of standing in front of so many people made his stomach twist. But when he saw the way Emma looked at him, her belief in his ability to rise to the occasion, he found himself nodding. As Mark stepped onto the makeshift stage, his heart pounded in his chest. The crowd fell quiet, their attention shifting to him. He gripped the microphone tightly, his palms sweating. For a moment, he was frozen, the weight of their expectant gazes pressing down on him. But then he looked out at the sea of faces, men, women, young, old, all of them united by a shared hope for change. And at the edge of the crowd, he saw Emma, her expression calm and steady, as if silently willing him to succeed. Mark cleared his throat, his voice shaky at first. Hi, he began, his usual bravado nowhere to be found. I'm Mark. Most of you probably don't know me, and that's okay. A couple of weeks ago, I didn't know most of you either. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. When I first came here, I didn't get it. The signs, the chanting, the standing in the square, I thought it was pointless. I thought Emma and everyone else here were wasting their time. A murmur rippled through the crowd, but Mark held up a hand. I was wrong, he said, his voice growing steadier. I was wrong because I didn't take the time to understand. I didn't see the bigger picture. I didn't realize that what you're all fighting for isn't just about words on signs or slogans. It's about people. Real people. He paused again, gathering his thoughts. I've spent most of my life tearing people down. Mocking them, belittling them, trying to make myself feel bigger by making others feel smaller. And it took coming here, meeting Emma, seeing all of you, to realize how empty that made me. The crowd was silent, their focus entirely on him. Mark took a deep breath, the words flowing more easily now. I know I can't change the past. I can't take back the things I've said or done. But I can choose to be better. And I think that's what this movement is all about. Choosing to be better. Choosing to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. Even when it feels like no one's listening. He looked out at the crowd, his gaze lingering on Emma. Because someone is always listening. And even if we only reach one person, that's enough. The crowd erupted into applause, the sound washing over Mark like a wave. He stepped back, the weight in his chest lifting. As he handed the microphone back to Emma, she gave him a small smile, her eyes shining with pride. You did good, she said. Mark chuckled, his hands still shaking. Thanks. That was terrifying. Emma laughed softly. You'll get used to it. Over the following weeks, the protest gained even more traction. Local news stations began covering their efforts, and social media was flooded with posts about the movement. People from all walks of life showed up to lend their support, their voices adding to the growing chorus demanding change. For Mark, the experience was transformative. He began reading up on the issues Emma was fighting for, educating himself in ways he never had before. The more he learned, the more he realized how much he didn't know. And while it was humbling, it was also empowering. For the first time, he felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. But not everyone was supportive. Mark's old friends mocked him relentlessly, calling him a sellout and accusing him of pandering to the woke crowd. At first, their words stung, but as time went on, he found himself caring less and less. Their opinions didn't matter anymore, not when he could see the real impact of the work he was doing. One evening, as the protest began winding down for the day, Emma approached Mark with a thoughtful expression. Can I ask you something? She said. Mark nodded. Sure. Why did you stick around? She asked. After that first day, when you could have just walked away, why did you keep coming back? Mark hesitated, the question catching him off guard. He hadn't really thought about it in those terms before. I don't know. At first, it was just curiosity. I wanted to prove you wrong, honestly. But then, he paused, searching for the right words. Then I started seeing things differently. Seeing you differently. Emma raised an eyebrow, a small smile playing at her lips. Seeing me differently? Mark nodded, his expression serious. You're not like anyone I've ever met. You don't just talk about change, you make it happen. You're brave, and you don't back down even when people like me try to tear you down. That's inspiring. Emma looked at him, her smile fading into something softer, more genuine. Thank you, she said quietly. That means a lot. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the days settling over them. Finally, Emma broke the silence. I think you're braver than you give yourself credit for, she said. Mark laughed, the sound self-deprecating. Yeah, I don't know about that. I mean it, Emma said. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong. To change. To stand up for something even when it's hard. Mark shrugged, his gaze dropping to the ground. I'm just trying to make up for lost time. Emma placed a hand on his arm, her touch light but grounding. You're doing more than that, Mark. You're making a difference. Mark looked at her, his chest tightening. He wasn't sure what to say, so he simply nodded. As the protest continued to grow, so did the challenges they faced. Local officials began cracking down on their gatherings, citing permits and noise complaints as reasons to shut them down. Emma remained undeterred, rallying her supporters and finding creative ways to keep their message alive. Mark, too, found himself stepping into a new role. He became a mediator, working behind the scenes to smooth over conflicts and keep things running smoothly. It wasn't a position he had ever imagined for himself, but it felt right. For the first time, he felt like he was using his skills for something meaningful. One afternoon, as they prepared for another rally, Emma pulled Mark aside. I have something for you, she said, handing him a small envelope. Mark opened it, his brow furrowing as he pulled out a simple pin with the words "We stand together" engraved on it. It's just a little thing, Emma said, her voice almost shy. But you've earned it. Mark stared at the pin, his throat tightening. He wasn't used to being recognized or appreciated, and the gesture caught him off guard. Thanks, he said finally, his voice rough. It means a lot. Emma smiled, her eyes warm. You mean a lot. To all of us. Mark looked at her, his chest swelling with a strange mix of pride and gratitude. For the first time in his life, he felt like he belonged. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. The protest had reached a tipping point, gaining attention from national media outlets and sparking debates across the country. Emma's name was everywhere, her speeches shared on social media, her determination lauded by activists and dismissed by critics. The movement had grown beyond the city square, rippling outward into other towns and communities. Mark found himself swept up in the momentum. The work was exhausting but exhilarating. Every day brought new challenges, coordinating with volunteers, responding to counter-protests, and ensuring the movement stayed peaceful despite the rising tensions. For the first time, he felt like he was part of something real, something that mattered. But with the movement's growing visibility came growing resistance. Local officials began ramping up their efforts to shut the protest down, citing safety concerns and accusing Emma of inciting unrest. Police presence at the square increased, and the threat of arrests loomed over every gathering. Despite the pressure, Emma remained steadfast. We're not backing down, she told the volunteers during a late-night meeting. Her voice was calm but firm, her eyes blazing with determination. They want us to give up, but we won't. This is too important. Mark sat in the corner, watching her with a mix of admiration and concern. He had seen her push herself to the brink over the past few weeks, working tirelessly to keep the movement alive. She was a force to be reckoned with, but even forces needed rest. After the meeting, Mark approached her as she gathered her notes. You should take a break, he said, his tone gentle but insistent. Emma looked at him, surprised. A break? Now? Yes, now, Mark said. You've been running on fumes for days. If you burn out, this whole thing falls apart? Emma hesitated, her expression conflicted. I can't just walk away. People are counting on me. And they'll keep counting on you, Mark said. But you're no good to anyone if you collapse. For a moment, Emma didn't respond. Then, reluctantly, she nodded. Fine. But only for a few hours. Mark smiled, relieved. Good. I'll handle things here. Go get some rest. As the night wore on, Mark found himself in the heart of the square, organizing supplies and talking with volunteers. The air was cool and quiet, the usual noise of the city softened by the late hour. He felt a strange sense of peace, a calm that had eluded him for most of his life. But that calm was shattered when a group of counter-protesters arrived, their voices loud and angry. Mark's stomach tightened as he watched them approach, their signs filled with hateful slogans. He had seen them before, men and women who dismissed Emma's movement as unnecessary, who clung to outdated beliefs about gender and power. Here we go, muttered one of the volunteers beside him, their tone tense. Mark stepped forward, his heart pounding. He wasn't sure what he was going to say, but he knew he couldn't stand by and let the situation escalate. Hey, he called out, his voice steady despite his nerves. What's the problem? One of the counter-protesters, a burly man with a shaved head, sneered at him. The problem is you people disrupting the city with your nonsense. Don't you have anything better to do? Mark crossed his arms, his gaze unwavering. We're here because this matters. If you don't agree, that's fine. But there's no need to cause trouble. The man scoffed, stepping closer. Trouble? You don't know the meaning of the word. Mark felt a surge of anger but forced himself to stay calm. We're not looking for a fight, he said. We're just trying to make the world a little better. If that bothers you, maybe you should ask yourself why. The man's sneer faltered, his bravado cracking just slightly. Before he could respond, another voice cut through the tension. Is there a problem here? Mark turned to see Emma approaching, her expression calm but firm. She had returned sooner than expected, her presence immediately commanding attention. The counter-protesters hesitated, their confidence wavering under her steady gaze. No problem, the burly man muttered, turning to leave. The others followed, their anger deflating as quickly as it had flared. Emma watched them go, then turned to Mark. What happened? Mark shook his head. Nothing. Just some jerks trying to stir the pot. Emma studied him for a moment, then smiled faintly. You handled it well. Mark shrugged, his chest swelling with a mix of pride and relief. I learned from the best. The next morning, Mark woke to the sound of his phone buzzing incessantly. He groaned, rubbing his eyes as he reached for the device. The screen was flooded with notifications, messages, missed calls, and news alerts. Frowning, he opened one of the alerts and felt his stomach drop. The headline read, Jonathan Hensley speaks out against daughter's protest. Mark sat up, his heart racing as he skimmed the article. In a statement released to the press, Jonathan Hensley had expressed concern about the movement, claiming it was divisive and counterproductive. While he stopped short of directly condemning Emma, his words sent a clear message. He did not support her efforts. Mark's mind raced as he read the article. This wasn't just a blow to the movement. It was a deeply personal betrayal for Emma. Her father's disapproval would be used as ammunition by their critics, undermining everything she had worked so hard to build. He got dressed quickly and headed to the square, his phone buzzing with more messages as he walked. When he arrived, the atmosphere was tense. Volunteers whispered to one another, their faces etched with worry. Emma stood near the pickup truck, her expression unreadable as she stared at her phone. Emma, Mark said, approaching her cautiously. I saw the article. She looked up, her eyes meeting his. For a moment, he thought she might cry, but she blinked the tears away and straightened her shoulders. It's fine, she said, her voice steady but brittle. We knew this was a possibility. Mark frowned. No, it's not fine. He shouldn't have done that. Not like this. Emma shook her head, a bitter smile tugging at her lips. He's protecting his image. That's all he's ever cared about. Mark's chest tightened at the pain in her voice. "What can I do?" he asked, desperate to help. Emma hesitated, then handed him a clipboard. "We keep going. We don't let this stop us." Mark nodded, his resolve hardening. "You've got it." The days that followed were some of the hardest the movement had faced. Critics latched onto Jonathan Hensley's statement, using it to discredit Emma and paint her as an ungrateful daughter trying to rebel against her father. Trolls flooded their social media accounts with hateful comments, and attendance at the protests began to dwindle. Through it all, Emma refused to give up. She showed up every day, her voice unwavering even as the challenges mounted. And Mark stayed by her side, doing whatever he could to keep things running smoothly. He had never felt more connected to a cause or to a person. One evening, as they packed up after a long day, Emma turned to Mark with a tired but grateful smile. "Thank you," she said. Mark frowned. "For what?" "For being here," she said simply. "For not giving up." Mark shook his head, his voice firm. "I'm not going anywhere." Emma's smile widened, the first genuine one he had seen from her in days. "Good. Because we've got a lot of work to do." As the protest entered its final week, a surprising development gave the movement a much-needed boost. A video of Mark's speech from weeks earlier began circulating online, gaining traction on social media. People were drawn to his raw honesty and his journey from skeptic to supporter. The video sparked a wave of renewed interest in the protest, bringing in new supporters and reigniting the passion of those who had started to lose hope. Mark was stunned by the response. He had never considered himself an activist, let alone an inspiration. But as he watched the comments flood in, messages of support, stories of people who had been moved by his words, he realized just how much he had changed. One comment stood out to him. "If he can change, maybe there's hope for the rest of us." Mark stared at the screen, his chest tightening. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was making a difference. And it was all because of Emma. As the video of Mark's speech continued to gain traction, the energy around the protest surged. The crowd at the square grew larger by the day, with people traveling from neighboring towns to join the movement. The once small protest had become a powerful symbol of resistance and hope, capturing the attention of even the national media. Journalists flooded the square, eager to interview Emma, Mark, and the other key players in the movement. For Mark, the attention was both exhilarating and overwhelming. He had never been the center of anything meaningful before, and now people were looking to him as an example of change. Reporters asked him about his transformation, about what had made him go from a skeptic to a believer. Each time, he pointed them back to Emma. "She's the one who made me see things differently," he told a young journalist from a local paper. "She showed me that standing on the sidelines isn't enough. If you want the world to change, you have to be part of the change." Emma, meanwhile, remained laser-focused on the movement. Despite her father's public disapproval and the mounting challenges they faced, she refused to waver. She spent every waking moment organizing, strategizing, and connecting with supporters. Her determination inspired everyone around her, including Mark. But as the protest grew, so did the pressure. Counter-protesters became more aggressive, and local officials continued to threaten legal action. Tensions were high, and it felt like the movement was teetering on the edge of a breaking point. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Mark found Emma sitting on the tailgate of the pickup truck, staring out at the empty square. She looked exhausted, her usual fire dimmed by the weight of everything she was carrying. "Hey," Mark said, approaching her cautiously. "You okay?" Emma sighed, rubbing her temples. "I don't know," she admitted. "It's just a lot." Mark sat down beside her, his gaze soft. "You don't have to do it all alone, you know. We're all here for you." "I know," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But sometimes it feels like it's not enough. Like no matter how hard we fight, the system will always win." Mark frowned, his chest tightening at the vulnerability in her voice. He had never seen her like this before, so uncertain, so human. "You're wrong," he said firmly. "You've already made a difference. Look at all the people who've shown up because of you. Look at how much this has grown. That's not nothing, Emma. That's everything." Emma turned to him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. But what if it's not enough? What if it all falls apart? Mark hesitated, then reached out to take her hand. Then we keep going, he said simply. No matter what. We don't give up. Emma stared at him for a long moment, then nodded. You're right, she said, her voice steadier now. We can't give up. Mark smiled, a warmth spreading through his chest. That's the Emma I know. The next morning, Emma called a press conference at the square. She stood in front of a crowd of reporters and supporters, her voice strong and clear as she addressed the challenges the movement was facing. We've come too far to turn back now, she said, her words carrying over the square. This isn't just about one city or one protest. This is about showing the world that change is possible, that we won't be silenced. Together, we are stronger than any system that tries to hold us back. The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the square. Emma stood tall, her resolve shining brighter than ever. Mark watched from the sidelines, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. She was incredible, and he felt honored to stand beside her. But not everyone was pleased. As the press conference ended and the crowd began to disperse, a group of counter-protesters approached, their voices loud and angry. They carried signs with hateful slogans and shouted insults at Emma and the other organizers. Mark stepped forward, his jaw tight. Back off, he said, his voice low and firm. One of the counter-protesters, a tall man with a sneer plastered across his face, laughed. What are you gonna do about it, tough guy? Mark didn't flinch. This is a peaceful protest. If you're here to cause trouble, you can leave. The man stepped closer, his posture threatening. Or what? Before Mark could respond, Emma appeared beside him, her presence immediately diffusing some of the tension. We're not here to fight, she said, her tone calm but authoritative. We're here to make a difference. If you can't respect that, you're welcome to leave. The man glared at her, his sneer faltering under her steady gaze. After a tense moment, he turned and walked away, muttering under his breath. The other counter-protesters followed, their anger deflating. Emma turned to Mark, a faint smile on her lips. Thanks for standing up for us. Mark shrugged, his heart still pounding. Just doing my part. As the movement reached its climax, Emma received an unexpected message from her father. He wanted to meet with her privately, away from the cameras and the crowds. At first, Emma was hesitant. She was still hurt by his public disapproval, and the thought of facing him felt overwhelming. But after some encouragement from Mark, she agreed. The meeting took place at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of the city. Emma arrived early, her nerves jangling as she waited for her father to arrive. When he finally walked through the door, she felt a mix of emotions, anger, sadness, and a flicker of hope. Emma, Jonathan said, his voice warm but cautious. Thank you for meeting with me. Emma nodded, her expression guarded. What do you want? Jonathan sighed, sitting down across from her. I wanted to talk. To explain. Explain why you threw me under the bus? Emma said, her tone sharp. Jonathan winced. I didn't mean to hurt you. I was trying to protect you. Protect me? Emma repeated, her voice rising. By undermining everything I've worked for? By making me look like a fool in front of the whole country? Jonathan shook his head, his expression pained. I was trying to shield you from the backlash. You have no idea how ruthless people can be, Emma. I didn't want to see you get hurt. Emma leaned forward, her eyes blazing. I don't need your protection. I need your support. I need you to believe in me, to stand with me instead of against me. Jonathan was silent for a long moment, his gaze dropping to the table. You're right, he said finally. I've been a coward. I've spent my whole life playing it safe, avoiding conflict, protecting my image. But you're braver than I ever was. Emma blinked, taken aback by his admission. That? Jonathan looked up, his eyes filled with regret. I'm sorry, Emma. For everything. I see now how much this means to you, and I want to support you. If you'll let me. Emma studied him, her emotions swirling. She wanted to believe him, to trust that he was sincere. But the wounds he had caused were still fresh. I don't know if I can forgive you, she said quietly. Not yet. Jonathan nodded, his expression somber. I understand, but I'll do whatever it takes to earn back your trust. When Emma returned to the square, Mark was waiting for her. He could tell from her expression that the meeting had been emotional. How did it go? He asked. Emma sighed, sitting down beside him. Better than I expected. Worse than I hoped. Mark nodded, understanding. Do you think he's serious about supporting you? I don't know, Emma admitted. But I guess we'll see. Mark placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. No matter what happens, you're not alone. We've got your back. Emma smiled, a flicker of gratitude in her eyes. I know. And that means everything. The final week of the protest was a turning point. With renewed energy and support, the movement achieved a major victory. The city council agreed to meet with Emma and her team to discuss their demands. It was a small step, but it was proof that their voices were being heard. As the square erupted into cheers, Emma turned to Mark, her eyes shining. We did it, she said. Mark grinned, his chest swelling with pride. You did it. Emma shook her head. We did it. Together. Mark nodded, his heart full. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be, standing beside Emma, fighting for a better world.